My name is Noshir Contractor. I'm from Northwestern University, just outside of Chicago in the United States. And I'm delighted to be serving as the moderator, or the host, as the case may be, for this panel that is titled From Social Media to AI, Lessons Learned. I want to start by introducing our three panelists. We are very fortunate to have the leading experts in three somewhat different areas, which I think is very important for us to be engaging on a topic such as social media to AI, lessons learned. I'll start with Chris at this end here. Chris, I'm doing this alphabetically. They're also conveniently sitting alphabetically, so that works out okay. Chris is a leading voice at the intersection of computational social science and political polarization. He's a professor of sociology, public policy, and data science at Duke University, and has just been announced as the director of a major center that is focusing on many of these issues related to data science and AI, especially with the focus on social aspects of it. He also has been the director of the Polarization Lab, which has been a pioneering hub for studying how social media shapes human behavior and political discourse. Amongst other things, he's the author of a very well-known, acclaimed book titled Breaking the Social Media Prism, How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing, something I'm sure will come up in conversation today. Yeah. In particular, I'll just give you a spoiler alert. He does not think that echo chambers are the root cause of polarization, or at least that's one way to characterize it, and I'm sure we will talk some more about that issue here. So our next panelist, again sitting there, is a critical legal and ethical perspective to the conversation. She's Dr. Sunimal Mendis, an assistant professor of intellectual property law at the Tilburg Institute of Law, Technology, and Society, which I guess has the acronym TILT.
That's right.
At Tilburg University in the Netherlands. And her research explores how law can evolve to meet the challenges of the digital public sphere in areas like IP, algorithmic content moderation, and freedom of expression. And I suspect we will talk about all of those and listen to what Sunimal has to say about those issues. She's also been involved with a very large project called DigiApps, which stands for Digital Governance of Internet for Accessible, Protected Public Spheres, funded by the Dutch Research Council, and has also been involved with the 2020 research sprint on AI and platform organized by the Humboldt Institute in Berlin. Finally, I'm delighted and honored to introduce Maximilian Max Schrems, one of the most influential figures in the global digital rights movement, privacy lawyer, activist, and founder of the organization called NOYB, which stands for None of Your Business. A Vienna-based nonprofit that enhances data protection law across Europe. The first I heard of Max was because when he became internationally well-known through his landmark legal battles against Facebook, Meta, resulting in two major decisions by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And those cases, those decisions, have come to be immortalized as Schrems 1 and Schrems 2. Spoiler alert, I'm going to ask you about Schrems 3, so start preparing for it now. And his work has fundamentally basically what the Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 did was they struck down international data transfer agreements between the EU and the US on privacy grounds. So he's been very involved in shaping data global flows, and this, of course, is of interest to all of us. So as you can see, the three panelists that we have today, I'll go in reverse order. Max brings a lot of the data activism lens to the issues we're talking about. Sunimal brings the legal ethical lens to it, and of course, Chris then brings the social lens to it, the social analysis lens to it, if you may. I want to start by framing this in the words of somebody that it's a trope that has been used many times in history, but the one that recently caught my attention was by Reid Hoffman, who was one of the, of course, the co-founder of LinkedIn, and he talked about in his recent writings about tech attitudes or attitudes towards technologies, and he classified people into four categories: the doomers, the gloomers, the zoomers, and the bloomers. So the doomers are the people who view AI as an existential threat, believing its development could lead to catastrophic outcomes. These are the people who think it's an unmitigated curse. We've certainly had discussions about doomers during this event here. The gloomers are the ones who are skeptical about AI's benefits, anticipating inevitable disruptions such as job displacement, societal challenges, etc. A third category are the zoomers, and as you can imagine, these are the enthusiasts who are eager to accelerate AI development, advocating for rapid investment, move fast and create things, as some of our bag logos have been saying out here. And they are not the ones who think that there is any risk, and if there are risks and problems that AI will cause, AI will solve the problems it causes. That's the credo of the people who are the Zoomers. And some of them would even say that when we talk about negative effects of AI today, it's like worrying about overpopulation on Mars someday. So we don't have to think about it for the next couple of decades at least. Which leaves us with the last group, which is the group who are the bloomers. And I think many of the people in this audience would probably fall into that category. I reckon to some extent that may be also true on the panel, but I'll let them brand themselves on their own when I'm done talking here, sorry. And bloomers are the ones who maintain a cautious optimism, supporting AI's progression while emphasizing the importance of ethical considerations, responsible implementation. These are the people who say that when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. And it's good science forecasting to be able to talk about predicting the car, but it's even better science forecasting if you can predict the traffic jam. So these are the people who look at these things and are realistic about where we want to go with that. Today our focus is titled From Social Media to AI, and I think one of the ways in which I think about what's happening to social media today is that ever more than before, it's being algorithmically infused. So I'm going to use the phrase algorithmically infused social media, and I draw the inspiration for that particular label from an article that I was lucky enough to be a co-author on that was published in Nature in 2022. And in that article, we talked about the algorithmically infused society that we all live in all facets of life, whether it's in socio-economic, cultural, political context. So with that, I want to also say that one of the things that we want to talk about today is recognize that there's a lot of excitement and a lot of hype about what is happening in social media and AI. And in some cases, it's not just excitement, it's the reverse of it. There's a lot of depression about what's happening in these particular contexts. But I'm always reminded of a saying by a technological forecaster by the name of Roy Amara, who passed away a few years ago. He was a futurologist, and he said that we always overestimate the effect of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. So something to keep in mind as we think about where we want to go with this. We obviously moved into a situation where a phrase that has come up several times in the last 2 or 3 days is the human in the loop. I like to think that what we are really looking at now is not an AI in the loop, but an AI in the group, where the group of humans are all there and the AI is just another element along with it that we want to think about here. So with that, I'm going to ask a question that was suggested to me by one of the organizers, who happens to be sitting in the third row here on the left, who asked the question, is the algorithmically infused social media the devil of everything? Who wants to go first? Go ahead.
Well, I know that statement is meant to be provocative, but it certainly opens up a nice line of thought, and I would respond this way. Well, in a lot of religious and mythological traditions, the devil is seen as a fallen angel, an entity that held out a lot of promise for enlightening the world, associated with light, which became subverted towards evil. And I would say in that sense, then perhaps social media is the devil, not because the technology per se is evil, but the way it is being governed is leading to it being subverted, its potential being subverted more towards bad rather than for the great potential it has for good. And when people say social media is the devil, they're not necessarily referencing the technology. They're talking about the ownership structures, the fact that social media now has become very vulnerable to corporate capture and thereby to political capture, capture by plutocrats, and resulting from capture, the way the governance is being carried out in a way that does not really serve the public interest. So that is my take on the provocative statement.
Does someone want to provoke what we just heard?
I have my issues with the devil in that sense because I'm probably just not religious enough. But I don't know if it's the devil in that sense. I mean, we see a lot of the in our practice, in the sense when we really litigate stuff, and I'm probably at the end result of what you guys are working on like the very end in some court, we see that just there is massive, people massively being overwhelmed. They don't know what they're doing. So a lot of, there's the saying of like, don't think about being evil if it's just stupidity. And this thing that we see in practice is that that's a big factor as well. It's just like a bit going back to this idea of just being overly optimistic, not really thinking what it is and so on, is that we see that a lot in practice as well. Not only, I mean, there's a lot of the evil, I mean, especially if we now see how politically, suddenly the rules are exactly the opposite because we have a new American president or whatever. So there's a lot of this really kind of strategic part of it as well. In the world we're working in, and it's mainly privacy, that's just a very small subset of the digital media issue. Then we see a lot of just incompetence and not thinking and believing in solutions that are just not realistic, which is a, let's say, large factor as well. Not the only one, but I would probably supplement that, so to say.
Chris?
I think maybe the problem with the metaphor is that it assumes that there's one sort of single all-powerful entity. That Mark Zuckerberg is sitting in a room with a dial. And, he has, and he alone has the chance to shape these outcomes that we're talking about. And that would be convenient in some sense if it were true, because we could we could attack the devil, we could deal with the devil. But really, what we're dealing with is something much more complex. I think there's user-driven elements to the problem. There's corporate elements to the problem, and really the problem is an entire system that is rewarding, profits and overlooking the pro-social origins of social media, which were not so long ago. Those of us who have been studying this for some time remember the early days when Facebook was connecting the world and solving organ donation and registering voters. And remember that? It's been a while, but somehow in between, it became not just a powerful source of what I study, political polarization, but also I think helped us connect with almost too many people. We became overwhelmed, as you said, Max. And so if we think of it just from the top down, it's problematic. We need to think both the top down and the bottom up.
You're right. I mean, at the same time, when Google was also having its original mantra was "do no evil," as part of what it was, we've come a long ways in terms of the way we think about those simplistic goals that were set by these big media companies right now. I want to do a second round on this topic, and I want to build on something Suni said. Suni said, well, we should try to move away from the devil and focus on what is good. I have a suspicion that the three of you have three very different definitions of what is good or what should be prioritized. Do you care to elaborate on it?
I should go ahead on what's good. To be frank, on a lot of that, I'm not a philosopher here, so we're really just like, we are applying the law as it is, so we're oftentimes like, it would be great if they would just follow the laws we already have. That would be my good right now. And that's already a far way ahead. We see more the opposite right now, best example is social media to AI, that now Meta is basically taking all the user data and wants to do the AI training on it. And what we see is that basically the authorities gave up on it, that the courts bend over, that just with this word like innovation, suddenly all these things do not apply anymore that are even in the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the EU. So on these ends, we basically see just a collapse to a certain extent of the order we already built, which is kind of interesting because, in the US setting, there's just to a certain extent just no law. So it's more of a political debate. Here it's interesting because we even have a We had a political debate in this specific sector, in other sectors not at all. But in this sector we had, I don't know, 90% of the European Parliament voting for something, and then just it's not enforced and not done. And it's interesting how you see that there was a bit of a time when they still tried to somehow follow. And we have a bit the feeling that the last half a year to year, there's finally this idea of we just do it anyways, and don't even try to pretend anymore to a certain extent. And that's a bit the worry we see more and more, that let's say even the wins we had so far are just like overwhelmed by reality. And that then questions how we can regulate it at all, because like the GDPR was probably one of the examples of actually regulation somehow being there, but then there's much more complex topics that we have never really properly regulated. And so you have a bit this situation that we deal with, but that's a bit my good in the sense that it would be nice if people would at least follow the laws we already have.
That's such a modest request, isn't it?
Yeah, like,
Just
I mean,
follow
for
the
anybody
laws.
parking in the wrong spot, it's kind of very reasonable. If you're a huge company, then suddenly apparently not so much anymore. And that's also, I think, for the general public hard to understand. Like, if, I don't know, I just took the subway here, if I wouldn't have had a ticket, I would have paid $100. And, if you're Meta, you just take the data and run and nothing happens.
Good point. So from your point of view, and I think you go by Suni as well rather than Sunimal, or do you prefer Sunimal?
Suni is fine. Everybody calls me Suni.
Everyone calls you Suni. So I'm on a first short name basis now with Suni. I'm going to call you Suni. And Chris, when you think about what could be righted and what could be made good out here, what in your mind would be the top priority?
Well, I have a slightly different idea of what would it mean for social media to be used for the good. And as a copyright scholar, I see social media as providing this really amazing space for public discourse and for the fostering of robust democratic discourse, which is also the overarching goal of copyright. Right? Copyright is not just there to make the creators or the entrepreneurs rich. It's there to make sure that the society is able to access, use, engage with a rich and diverse body of creative and cultural content, which can then fuel their own discourse and their own understanding of the world. And that is really, for me, the potential held out by social media, and not just the traditional social media websites, but also now we are going towards the metaverse. We have these immersive 3D environments. And Chris said we are being overwhelmed by the potential for connectivity. And I understand that is a problem because we are not used to it. We don't know how to use it. We don't know how to behave. But it is also an amazing opportunity for humankind, that all these barriers can now go down, the geographical barriers, the distance. So for me, if we are optimizing the governance of social media, then the end goal should be to protect it and to foster it as a space for inclusive, open, democratic discourse.
Great. And then, Chris, I know, given what you just said and given your own work in the area of polarization, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit or the most important fix, either one of those?
Yeah, I think the original sin of social media, most social media platforms anyways, is that they lacked a purpose. They lacked a definition of good, right? So we had Facebook, which was connecting us. We had Twitter, which was serving the public conversation, whatever that means, right? Instagram was originally named Bourbon and facilitated alcohol-centric gatherings, right? These were small esoteric communities that grew into, democracy's public square, if I can build upon what you said a little bit. But the problem is they have no North Star. They have plenty of engineers can develop really creative solutions once we know what we want to optimize for. And so far, we've optimized for the absence of toxicity, which is not good, right? It's not the useful, productive conversations that we might have that could, for example, inform us about the world or help us bridge social divides, right? Instead, we've optimized for the absence of the bad. So the question is exactly the right one, I think. And for me, it's, social media should add something to your life. It should help, it should educate you. It should connect you to new ways of thinking and this sounds naive, But I really think if we go back to the halcyon early days of social media, there was a moment, where it really was 1,000 flowers blooming, and now it's sort of like a large parking lot. And occasionally we get a tiny little flower growing out of the cracks. So the question, I think, is how do we build better gardens where flowers can grow, not, what do we do about the pavement,
I'll probably add one thing. At least in a political debate that I find quite interesting, that there is not really any bold idea on the political side either. In Brussels, just one example, there are hundreds of examples. There was always the question about opening up social media, to have federated social media so I can choose my provider as one example that has up and downs and so on. But long story short, it's really interesting that the answer is always like, oh my God, we couldn't possibly. Or on advertisement, I'm oftentimes running around, it's like, that we limited advertisement to 10% of the time in TV and radio? Like, you can't advertise more than 6 minutes per hour? If we would do that on Instagram, first of all, a lot of the shit would be gone. A lot of people would just like it for not that much stuff, but just even the idea of regulating it oftentimes is seen as impossible. Now, obviously, you need smart concepts for that and smart people to come up with them, and there is a bit of a lack of that as well. But that would be, I think, oftentimes interesting, at least in a European context, which may be much harder in the US context for the political reality. There is also a bit a lack of this idea of how could it be and what are the North Stars that these companies may never come up with, or a North Star that we just may not believe as a society in, but cannot the political sphere give that North Star to a certain extent and then enforce it. And there's a little bit of that, like with DMA, DSA ideas and so on, but like it's homeopathic doses of proper regulation. It's really interesting if you look at comparatively and like other classic media that is highly regulated oftentimes, where we have no problem with that, but once it's digital, the politicians are like, oh, we couldn't possibly. And that's quite interesting for me, is this kind of like laissez-faire attitude that got fostered, generated, just is there, I don't know. But that gets the democratic side of this discussion kind of out of the room, because we then depend on whatever someone in this company decides.
You brought up the issue of decentralized social media, and there have been some moves in that area. We haven't spoken much about it here. ActivityPub is a protocol that Mastodon and Blue Sky also wants to be an open standard in this area. And it's interesting because I actually attended a conference about this in Brussels last year, and I know there's a lot of interest in the EU, in Europe, much more so than in the United States about that. So that may also be a difference, though Blue Sky now seems to be winning that race on its own in that particular fashion. I'm going to pick up on something Max said in your earlier response, and the hypothetical situation. Let's say Meta builds a Gen AI tool trained on publicly shared Facebook posts. Some might say it already has. My question to you is, how would you react to it? If you had to think of it as, what do you see as the dire consequences that would come about from doing that? I'm trying to bring the AI part into the social media with that question.
So, how do we react to it? That's on our website 2 weeks ago. We sent them a cease and desist letter and said, we're probably going to litigate you on this. That's kind of our reaction on it. On an AI level, I'm not an AI expert, so I tried to kind of put that up front. We do now see the first cases of problems. And to give you one, we had like this guy that was basically, with his own name and everything, it's on our website too, told that he, I think, killed half of his kids, sexually molested the others, blah, blah, blah. And you go to OpenAI and say, could you correct that? And the answer is, no, we couldn't possibly. And it's quite interesting because you do have a right to correction. All of that would typically be a slander case and so on as well. But they now kind of really try to stay above it and not engage with it. And that is at least where we see the consequences now. On my feelings around that, to be honest, they're still very fuzzy on my end as well, because AI to me is something I try to understand, but there are people that understand it better. We just now see the first cases on our end where people have real life consequences, and that's maybe then a bit more tangible. And I think largely the stomach feeling, it's like I put tons of data there. I generated myself. It was my work that I put on a platform, and now to basically take it and train their stuff from it and make the profit from it. So even on that side, people are just like, why? let alone that Meta cannot explain to you if that data comes out somewhere else on the AI in the end. To give you an insight in litigation that is just ongoing is they, for example, say there's a low risk that your data is going to be reproduced through a prompt. But I was like, great, if the risk is 1%, and then for all of Europe, that's 4 million people whose data is popping out on the other side of the system. And all of that is quite interesting because they themselves cannot really give you a clear answer. And so it's for us also a bit hard to grasp it because like even they don't really know what they can guarantee or not.
So it's a privacy nightmare for you, if that would...
It may be, let's put it that way. We don't have the results right now, but let's say there is a part in Llama which this is going to go into, which is a public, I mean, it's an open source model. Let's say you can actually pull something out of that, and then it's downloaded a million times throughout the globe. You're never going to get that data back anymore. You know, let alone that, I don't know, Russian aggressors may use that model to just like bombard us with shit that is trained on our own social media data. So there's a lot of these things where you wonder if all of that makes a lot of sense.
So Llama being, I mean, I think my AI colleagues who are experts more than me would remind me many times that calling Llama open source comes in many shades of
downloadable on the internet.
So it is open source in the sense that you can run the model, but the data that is trained is not open, and in many ways the weights are open, but the methods, the code that they use to estimate those weights is not open either. So that word open source, when applied to any of these tools, Llama but other LLMs, should be taken with a pinch of salt and maybe
or the argument
even more.
I tried to make, like, think about that in 10 or 20 years when we probably figured out how all of that works, because it's 20-year-old stuff, but we still have the data in the model, and someone is going to be like, hey, interesting, what can we re-engineer? I don't know if that's possible, but you know, it's at least thinkable.
So, Suni and Chris, what do you see as the nightmare of if Meta were to build a Gen AI tool trained on publicly shared Facebook or Instagram data or WhatsApp data? They have all of those.
Well, I guess as the copyright person, I would then focus on what are the consequences if these developers of generative AI models then use published copyright-protected content to train their models. I won't touch on the data protection thing because I think Max has made the problem very clear. And I understand completely that where data protection is concerned, there are risks, there are actual risks. But I feel that when the discussion goes towards copyright, it's slightly different. Because if this content has already been published, and if it is only being used by a model for the purposes of learning, then I don't think that there is a strong enough case for copyright enforcement at the learning stage, at the input stage. At the output stage, if the model actually does reproduce something, of course that's a problem. But if without going into all the technicalities, copyright is there to make sure that people, authors, plus the entrepreneurs who invest in the authors, who make some investment towards the creation and dissemination of creative content, they are able to recoup their investment. And as far as I can see, at the moment, there isn't a good enough case made that the fact that copyright-protected content is being used without authorization for the purpose of training generative AI models actually prevents these people from recouping the fair investment. There are other arguments being made that yes, but this is human-generated creativity that is then being used to make corporates richer, that AI can then start generating content which can provide the public a similar level of utility, aesthetic utility at least, if not dialogic utility as human-generated content. But for me, these are valid arguments, but those arguments are not strong enough to make a case that no, we should start requiring licenses for the use of this content for training generative AI models.
So that's a really interesting point. It's a little different from what I thought you might say. You seem a little more open to this idea, less concerned about it. Tom Malone, who is a faculty member at Sloan School of Management at MIT, has made an argument that while we have copyright that protects somebody else taking our text and using it, he's argued for us to consider something that would be the equivalent of learn right. That is the right to learn from my materials rather than to copy it. What are your thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I think that also ties in with the right to read is the right to mine. that if that content is available for a human to read, then how is that very different from what a machine is doing, which is also learning from the information, obtaining the information, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. I completely understand the concerns that human creators have, especially because AI, to some extent, may be able to replace certain employment opportunities that are currently available to humans, and it is possible that AI-generated output might compete with human-generated output, but I also don't think that, at least at the present level of technology, the threat is as serious as people also make it out to be. Because if you compare something that is created by a professional artist and something that can be generated on DALL-E, for instance, you see the difference in the quality. So for me, in this instance, I'm definitely a zoomer, I think. I think that we are becoming a bit more worried than what is warranted at the present moment.
It reminds me of a quote that Demis Hassabis, Nobel Prize winner, made recently about 3 levels of creativity. He said the first is when we take machine learning, we can ask it to interpolate. So you give it a lot of cats and it will create a new cat, but that's an interpolation amongst all the cats that it has. The second level of creativity is extrapolation, where you give it a whole bunch of games of playing Go, for example, and it comes up with a new move that became memorable because no one had thought it would be that way, and that's extrapolation. And then the third one, which he says we have not yet achieved in the space of Gen AI, is creating systems that would create new games like Go, not just playing Go better, but finding new games like Go, and that we are still away from that. And so your argument reminds me that we are still at that first 2 levels of creativity in this context. Chris, tell us about what you think is or is not a nightmare, given your own research or just general sensibilities on this topic.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not the expert on privacy or intellectual property here, so maybe I'll change the focus a little bit to think about democracy and political attitudes.
Yep.
I think the nightmare situation may have happened 2 weeks ago. And this was when a group of researchers at the University of Zurich trained a set of chatbots to go onto Reddit in an attempt to see how quickly they could win points on a subreddit called Change My View. So if you're not familiar, this is a community where people are rewarded for changing each other's minds about controversial topics. Like you may come on and say, I really don't believe in trans rights. Convince me, right? And the researchers very rapidly discovered that these chatbots could very easily change people's minds and win deltas. But by resorting to any style of argument possible, including making up fictitious elements of their lives. I think this shows that, unconstrained by reality, chatbots, as they begin to make a critical transition from a single interaction with a single user, which is, I think, how most of us are experiencing chatbots right now, to navigating entire social systems, right? There's real potential for things to go off the rail. There's also grounds for optimism. So here, I'll join Team Bloomer a little bit too, or you're Zoomer, I guess I'm Bloomer. Maybe I'm a little Bloomer. Which is to say, and this sort of gets to the Demis Hassabis point, there are also new opportunities. So just as generative AI will create a new, more powerful misinformation campaign, like you mentioned, Max, it might also facilitate new ways of reducing political polarization. So in our lab, we did an experiment 3 years ago with the social media platform Nextdoor, which is a small residence-based social media platform, if you're not familiar with it. And it's actually, in the US, the most toxic platform there is. And we simply intervened by having a chatbot read an already toxic conversation between 2 people. And then before one person sends the message they're about to send, they get a prompt from a model that says, essentially, would you like to say this differently? We didn't change the meaning of the message, just the way in which it was said, consistent with evidence-based conflict mediation work. And sure enough, this intervention reduced toxicity by about 15 to 25%, we think. So there's, as with so many other things, I love the way you frame the conversation, Noshir, around technology being multifaceted and complex. There's always good and bad. So I think maybe we'll all ultimately be in the bloomer-gloomer zone.
That sounds right. I think that would be the sweet spot for, or the sweet spots in this particular context. This notion of being inundated by misinformation from bots, and that doesn't matter whether the information is right or wrong, it is able to persuade these people on that subreddit channel, reminds me of a quote that Renee Itarista, who used to be running the Stanford Internet Center, wrote an article in Atlantic back in 2022, I think, where she said, misinformation is not the problem. The problem is, reducing the supply of misinformation is not going to solve the problem because the demand still remains for it. The people are crave that, the polarized views that I think you found in your research and talking in the book that you talk about as well. That people go towards that, and that sort of is incentivized within these contexts. So I'm going to change gears a little bit now, and unless someone wants to add a follow-on comment, I think I saw your hand up, Max, a while ago. You want to add something to this?
All good.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's a little bit and talk about another question that I was advised for us to discuss, and which I like a lot, and that is the power of these AI-infused social media platforms and their ability to structure the public discourse. In the field of communication, there is and this is one of the things that I think is important for us to remember, that many of these new debates that we are happening with new social media or algorithmically infused or AI-infused social media have actually existed for lots of previous media, going back to the newspaper and the rags. Misinformation was a problem there as well, and so these are not necessarily new problems. They definitely have new nuances that make it fundamentally different in form, but these issues have been with us for a long time. Echo chamber is not a new thing. Polarization is not necessarily a new thing. Well, one of the things that has looked at this in the context of old mass media was a theory called agenda setting theory. And agenda setting theory said, what exactly is the role of the newspaper, or at the time the three television networks? Is it to tell people what to think, or is it to tell people what to think about? And the difference is, you tell people what to think is you're telling them, you need to have this particular kind of viewpoint, a left or right, etc. The alternative is what to think about, which then puts on the agenda with, for example, a presidential election in the United States. Is this about the economy? Is this about our culture? Is this about national security? And those are different topics. And so, and in the context of public discourse, what do you see as the role, the current status of what AI-infused social media is doing and what it should do from each of your vantage points?
Well, what do we mean by AI? I think is a good place to start, right? I mean, AI is such a broad term. I assume we're principally focused on generative AI. And,
yes.
Certainly, I'll sort of keep with the theme and give the good and the bad. So I think the bad is pretty obvious. The agenda setting function really becomes outsourced to models, and we know already that people are highly deferential to most of the large language models, and there's a kind of mythology around the large language models which enables that kind of power, which is to say that people think they're flawless, even if most of the people in this room know they're not. And so there's this question of deference, and the most pernicious impact of, say, a misinformation campaign could be to change the agenda, to change the setting, and so on and so forth. On the flip side, what if a AI-infused social media, and I'm going to paint a rosy picture, what if it helped us become aware of our biases? What if it strategically recommended, content that addressed gaps in our typical information consumption patterns? What if it helped us communicate better across political divides? We know that large language models are exceptionally good at style transfer, learning how to communicate in the language of another. We also know that they are they have endless patience to observe us, right? Which is creepy from a privacy standpoint, but perhaps very useful when we think about amplifying and overcoming some of the biases that tend to guide our social media behavior.
Go ahead. Yep.
No. It's very interesting, but I was also thinking of this kind of agenda-setting role that you referred to. And I think, indeed, that is very strong, and it also becomes more a norm-setting role, I feel, because AI is very seductive, and many humans tend to trust AI when AI gives it a certain answer. Even if we are used to questioning something that a human tells us, but when the AI tells us, we think, no, it has to be right, because it's doing it on a scientific, logical basis. And that is what makes it so dangerous, for instance, when it is used for content moderation on social media platforms. So copyright, although normally if you want to use or reuse a copyright protected work, you need to get the authorization of the owner. There are certain users that fall within these so-called exceptions and limitations. These are users for which you don't require authorization. And one of these is the creation of parodies. Right? If you want to create a parody based on a copyright protected image, you don't need the authorization. But if you do create a parody and you upload it onto, say, Facebook, and the Facebook algorithm says, you cannot upload this because this is copyright infringing, from that point on, that user is going to believe that what they created is not a parody. And their understanding of what constitutes a parody or not is then going to be governed by what the AI defines as a parody. And for me, that is also dangerous. And you also see this with regard to large language models. So just to share an anecdote, I was just playing around with ChatGPT to find out, its understanding of copyright. And I asked it, so what is your copyright policy? And it gave me this wonderful policy. Yes, copyright is very important. I will not infringe on copyright. If you give me a prompt that might lead to infringement, I will tell you, and I will suggest blah, blah. Then I told it, yes, well, can you write me a small short story that builds up on the Harry Potter characters, a sequel to the last book? And it gave me a very nice paragraph. And I said, yes, but now you told me you are respecting copyright, but you produce this output, which is clearly copyright infringing because you are referring to these characters by name, you are using their characteristics, etc. So what do you say about this? And then ChatGPT tells me this is not infringement because it falls under the private use exception in paragraph in provision blah 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 of this. And for a moment I was really taken aback, and I was like, does it actually fall under the private use exception? Now that is not for ChatGPT to determine. That is something that should be determined by a judge in a court, because this is something that goes so beyond the scope of private use. Maybe it is possible to interpret. But if it tells me that, and if I'm not somebody who really understands copyright, that is going to frame my understanding of what is lawful and unlawful. So for me, this is this is one of the main problems I see, this norm-setting effect, which allows the AI to tell us what is correct and incorrect.
And I think that, that you've given a great example, and the anecdote is really telling about the norm-setting effect of AI. I imagine that this also becomes an increasing more complicated because these norms vary across different cultures and countries. And there's a lot of research already showing that people are much more likely to trust AI in developing countries in the global south than they might be in the US or in Europe, for example. So anyway, but Chris, how do you want to add to that in terms of structure in the public?
I would quickly add to that. Actually, the original thing I want to say is very similar to what you said, but in very simple, blunt terms, it's great at bullshitting. Like, bullshitting is a technique we know ever since. And
is that a technical term?
I think so, yeah. But, just boldly saying something and, hoping that everybody believes you, it does that really perfectly. And I was quite shocked in that sense that to be frank, didn't use stuff all too much. But there were two events that were kind of interesting and super anecdotal, and I think a lot of people in the room probably know much more about really evidence-based things on that. But this case we had with the one dude where he, killed half of his family. An Austrian TV company then asked on Maröferstraße, the shopping street right back there, is like, would you believe that? And literally everybody that they interviewed was like, more or less, yeah, sure, if ChatGPT tells me something, why would I question it? There's obviously all the disclaimers of the world, but that's it. And you now see it quite well when Google Search now added its summary function, and I think in at least my German browser, it's rather recent that it does that. Half of the stuff is just blatantly wrong. And it's quite amazing that, it's basic questions of, I don't know, I recently asked, when is the Semmering base tunnel finally done? And it told me next year. And I was like, some politicians would be very happy about that. But it's very simple Wikipedia questions where it even footnotes Wikipedia as the source, but it just gets the wrong data out of it. And that's, for me, quite shocking in the sense that, we can probably paint over that a little bit and it's going to get better, but are we going to get to a level where people can actually trust the answers here?
Yeah.
And that's not even trying to manipulate it. That's all stuff where they try to do the right thing. Obviously, when you try the other direction, it may get even more problematic. And that is a bit the part of like over believing it, because right now what I do is there is an AI generated stuff which costs a lot of CO2 emissions and it doesn't help me, and the only thing I do right now is scroll over it and get to the first normal Google result, because I by now learned that that's probably giving me the answer more than the summary. So I think that may be a bit of a addition of real life on this, but I think what's really interesting is statistical evidence of how much do people really believe, how does that trust system actually work, these things that I assumed are researched in other areas than mine.
Do you want to respond? Any of you want to respond to that question, to that comment of the assumption of other people researching that?
Earlier you mentioned, there are previous examples of misinformation on newspapers and so on and so forth. And, the Google search had issues in this respect too, right? There's a very interesting study about a year ago in Nature, very, fancy study, looking at can people use Google to get to the root of misinformation? Turns out no. Turns out it often makes it worse, right? So I think we have a twin problem. One is the deference to AI, right? There's this mythology around AI. Another is sort of motivated reasoning, right? We like some facts more than others, or pseudo-facts, right? So if we think about the suggestibility, right, which perhaps is combined with the confidence, this is where things, I think, get particularly dangerous, because it's not only, sometimes wrongly confident, but also can play to our style.
Yep. Max, I was going to try to pick your brain, given your specific area of expertise. You've talked recently about you just talked about the fact that it gets it wrong and we think it's right, and it reminded me of the GDPR right to be forgotten. And that was based on the premise that even if something was true, you had the right to need to have the system forget it. Are we at a stage, or what do you think about whether there needs to be a discussion about the right to not be predicted, whether it is to be predicted correctly or falsely?
We actually have literally pending litigation on this, so I can't expand on that. There is already a right to rectification in GDPR. Not just the GDPR, also in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So if there's wrong information about you, you have a right, if it's personal information, to correct it. Like a lot of the other AI-generated stuff would not fall under it because not personal data, but for personal data you can. And what's interesting is the first answer that these companies tell you, it's a prediction, so it's not, you cannot correct a prediction. I was like, if I predict that tomorrow it's gonna be minus 20 degrees and snowing in Vienna, then that's a wrong prediction. And I think I can correct the wrong prediction. So there is a discussion right now, is like how much can you also correct factually false predictions? And there is obviously wiggle room in predictions. Like if you say is it more 25 or 20 degrees, probably that's still within the realm of truth. But some of it is just obviously false, and then you get into that. So I think we would even have the legal system for that already, as long as we just assume that a prediction can be 10% off or 20% off, and all of that can be calculated. We're actually right now working on a project that I can't talk too much about, but a lot of these predictions are mathematical systems. And there have been people for 100, 200 years figuring out how these mathematical systems work. And you can literally later say, does your model make any sense or not? And that can be calculated and after all also objectified to say this is a model that is solid or this is a model that just produces crap. So on that side, I think that's doable with the law that we have already. The right to be forgotten is a different story in that sense. We had that as well with AI systems in some of the lobby calls that we get involved with, where they said, no, we can't change it because it's now, so to say, hard-coded into the model. And again, people in the room probably know much more about that, but I was like, how about like fine-tuning? You can fine-tune other stuff out of a model. How can you not fine-tune a false result out of the model if it's about people's data, not like stuff you're interested in getting out of the model? And then the answer was quite interesting, at least from the lobbyists. You know, most of them are not technicians, so they tell you random stuff. But the answer was more or less, yeah, we could, but that will cost money, and we don't want to do that. And it was like, so you want to have the profits from it, but not the cost that correction would cost in this? So I think a lot of that will probably also over the next years, how should I say, even itself out. Because right now they're like, no can do, but if you kind of poke that a little bit, then oftentimes they're like, yeah, actually we can. And one last thing I want to say about that was really interesting is if you read a lot of these GDPR principles, people in the 80s came up with that, so way before I was born. And the idea of that was to actually have in the future some algorithm that somehow sucks up data and somehow produces some results that we cannot control, and it's going to not be transparent, and therefore we need all these rules. So, I mean, if you have this kind of theory that they had of what at some point is going to be there, that's more or less a description of AI, at least, you know, the contours of it. And it's quite interesting now where we're there. Suddenly the narrative comes up, oh, we should get rid of all these rules because they interfere with exactly that thing. So we're like, probably these rules were exactly written for the situation we're in. And it's a bit of an interesting narrative that's used. I sometimes joke it's a bit like saying we have 100 kilometers an hour speed limit, but now we have the first car that can actually go 120, and now we have to get rid of the speed limit. That's kind of the narrative that the industry tries to paint. Not saying that we don't have to, you know, adjust to the reality that we have, but this kind of blatant kind of painting over it and saying all of that is innovation and therefore your law should go away, it is quite interesting if you look at the history of these laws.
That's a good point. But that was the original motivation for it. And now when we realize that particular vision, it's time to change the law that was motivated for exactly this vision.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean, I'm a bit like the law was probably more innovative than you guys, so.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned about the fine-tuning example, we saw a recent instance of that where it's really not that difficult for these Gen AI tools. Some of you may recall, have read about when X all of a sudden one day decided spewing out unprovoked comments about white racism in South Africa. And Elon came on and said, well, that was a mistake that some program had made, and they were able to fix it in 24 hours. So it couldn't be that expensive, either money-wise or time-wise, to be able to move these things in and out of LLMs, at least in that particular case. I'm going to go to questions in about 6 minutes here from the audience to give a half hour. Is it? The session goes till 3:30, right? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't see that. Okay. Well, you will. I promise you, you will be the first question.
6 minutes. I'll let you ask questions.
I will do that in 6 minutes. Now 5. Okay. So back here, one last question, and this question may have been motivated more by my reading, Chris, of your work, because you've written a lot about moving beyond sort of top-down moderation and moving to, you know, so what role do things like norms and nudges and other aspects of digital architecture play in fostering more constructive dialogue? I mean, and also I want you to talk a little bit about why you have your thesis about why the echo chamber is a bit of a myth. So let me start you off with that, and then others can add to it as well.
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, just to come back to another theme, you know, these sort of just so stories, right? It's just a perfect story that it's so believable. You know, I myself like the thesis of the echo chamber. It's intuitive. It explains why Brexit happened. It explains, if you don't like Trump, it explains why Trump happened. You know, pick your story. We were all, you know, not listening to each other. It's, you know, works with every theory of democracy I know. But we now have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you know, very high quality studies published internationally by scholars at places like Oxford and MIT and Stanford and very wonderful universities all over the world that have largely concluded that the echo chamber, defined as a political echo chamber, so we're in other kinds of echo chambers, cultural echo chambers, it doesn't really exist, or it's a very small part of the population that is properly in an echo chamber. Now why? That's because most people don't care about politics. So it's sort of a sad reason why. Most people don't follow enough political accounts to be in a political echo chamber. But it does sort of raise this foundational question, which is the premise if you listen to people like Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, you often hear about a competition of ideas. We're on social media so that we can really hash it out, and we can, more engage with a more diverse group of people. And this is the most beautiful idea in the early days of social media. I think many of us were intrigued by it. But this is not why people use social media. People do not, the evidence shows, many studies show, we don't go on there to have reasonable debate, to disagree better, right? Or if we do, it's a tiny, tiny part of the population. So we've misunderstood the motivations of users. I think many others think, that fundamentally we go on social media to do what all humans do, which is to find out what other people think about us. And we're obsessed with status, and so if we think of social media users as largely status-seeking creatures, it changes the way we think about how we might re-engineer the whole system. So for example, right now we've optimized for things like engagement, right? The more engagement, the more you see someone. And of course this, enables a minority of people to dominate the conversation. But in our lab, we prototyped something called a bridging algorithm, which instead of optimizing for engagement, it optimizes for consensus. So if multiple different types of people are engaging with your content in a positive way, we want to show that to more people. And we worked with Twitter for half a year to implement this technology, pre-Elon, so this is now long dead. And again, 15 to 20% drop in sharing of misinformation according to a large field experiment on the platform. So there are ways of incentivizing better behavior, attaching status to things like being productive and changing people's minds, right? It won't work everywhere, right? It won't solve every problem on social media. But I personally think that the moment where we were all mutually attuned on one or two platforms for a very brief part of time, I think is now sort of part of history. I don't think we'll ever quite have something like that again. So the question is, how do we incentivize it goes back to your earlier question, what is good and how do we engineer for it?
So, in that case, we had a social media minute that we can now look back at nostalgically from a few years ago. So I think what you've said is that you would want to choose ways, mechanisms to optimize for identity exploration, social learning. And I think, Suni, what I heard you say is emphasize inclusion, freedom of expression. What are concrete ways in which you would think of doing that?
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, as Chris said, we are focusing so much on making sure that the toxic content is out. We forget about, there is also a positive function that these spaces can actually promote good discourse, positive discourse. And indeed, if we want people to start behaving in positive ways that can actually contribute to the community, then one way of doing that is by rewarding good behavior. And you see that being implemented in platforms like Wikipedia, where if you have been contributing content and you have been a good community member acting responsibly, then you get peer recognition, you get more responsibility. So if you want these participatory forms of governance, especially, then you also have to show the users that these are the sorts of behavior and values and norms and ethics that on this platform that we actually want. And if you behave accordingly, then you will be rewarded in certain ways. And I think that is something that actually could go a long way towards solving a lot of these problems, because now, at the moment, we really see social media governance and AI as a they problem. Okay? It's up to the people who design the technology, it's up to the governments, it's up to the owners to fix these for us. And we forget that as the user, most of the problems are things that arise because of the way we use these platforms and the technology, and our lack of awareness, our lack of education. So if we are going to then start educating people and making them active stakeholders in governing these spaces, then one way to start that is by telling people that actually this is how we want you to behave, and if you behave that way, then you will be rewarded.
Well, we can hope that happens. The last one, and I'm coming to Moshe, but Max, if I had to guess, you would probably want to optimize for data autonomy, accountability. Correct me if I'm wrong, amend it, and what would be the one thing from your vantage point, besides enforcing the current laws, what would be something else that you would want to see, a new law that you would like to enforce, would like to fight for?
No, I think I would subscribe to a lot what was said before. Again, we're not the forethinker of these things. We're just a cleanup service of what went wrong so far. So other people really have more insights on that or more views. I would add a little bit to like the user side is what I do have a bit of a problem with sometimes is the responsibility shift that we see in some of these arguments that the user should, so to say, do ABC. The reality is just like in society, people have 100 other topics, and we are probably concerned with that, but most people work 10 hours and then need to go home and just put something there. So I think to a certain extent, the systems have to embrace that and incentivize de facto, and that oftentimes then gets a response. What we generally walked away very strongly is that user education will do it. Because it's a bit like back the tobacco industry that said, you know, it's not us, but it's you smoking, or the plastics industry that said it's not us producing the plastic, it's you not recycling. So we see a very strong argument in that direction in the digital sphere. And we've seen in all other areas that's not how anything works. I think the question of how we can incentivize like positive behavior, and we see that in society usually. I mean, the one person sitting in the corner screaming is usually not the one that's invited for a beer later. But that is to a certain extent something that probably algorithms can pull into, obviously. That all being said, I think we really have to, in reality, to get any of this done, we structurally need to get into it in the sense that we need to say, okay, we have certain rules and norms that you will have to comply with, otherwise, you know, you're not going to be available in the society anymore. And if we think how strongly regulate, I don't know, chemicals that could at some point give you some cancer, you know, some of these algorithms being wrong gives our whole society massive problems right now. So I think we need to be a bit bolder there, but be smart at the same time. And that's a bit where I'm worried that sometimes there's bold, but then not really the, you know, necessary research that probably would inform these things properly.
So I'm going to go to questions. To summarize, again, what I'm hearing is Chris is saying, you know, how do we shape our identities? What are the identity algorithms that could be the villains? I'm hearing Max say that is the surveillance architecture that we need to be concerned about, that is at the other end of it. And then Suni in the middle is like, no, we need to be able to make sure that we educate or inform or enlighten the user about the ways in which they can engage in better behavior. Clearly, each of these is going to help, but not without the other two in that case. With that, I open up the question. Moshe first, and then I see another hand back there.
Thank you for this amazing discussion, but there are two critical C words that have not been mentioned. One is children. There is a mental health crisis, at least in the United States. I'm less familiar with what's happening in Europe. We can't control experiments, but the preponderance of evidence, the combination of smartphone and social media is largely responsible for that. To the point is, we're talking about a wave of suicides among, you know, suicide rate among ages 10 to 14 triple in the 10 years after the introduction of social media on smartphones. So it's not just about polarization. We're talking about something much more, you know, critical than that. The second C word that was not mentioned is curation. There is this illusion that we are seeing on social media is what our friends post. This is just a fallacy. This is not true. Mark Zuckerberg does control what you see on Facebook. Not directly. He doesn't decide what you're going to see. You know, white racism is a special case. But the algorithm is, this company has a monopoly on the curation algorithm. And there is an idea of using antitrust law, one to declare them, like they take Facebook, there's no competition really to Facebook. Even Google couldn't compete with them because of network laws. You know about this, right? Medical law. And it means that they have monopoly not only on the platform, but on the curation. And the proposal was to force them to open an API so I can get Contractor's moderation algorithm or your curation algorithm. So the idea is we train the user better is an illusion. Users have no control over what they see. They have control over what they post, but not what other people see or what they see. The curation algorithm decide, and that is the one knob that at least we can tell Facebook what to do, but by fostering competition, we can hope that people will say, I don't like this moderation algorithm, I like a better moderation algorithm.
Okay, thank you. So reactions to C and C. children, and yeah.
Yeah, I think that the children, I agree, it's really important. But I think the research is really, really convoluted here. I would take issue with the characterization that we know for sure it's social media. The National Academies of Science in the US convened 16 of the best researchers we have in this area, computer scientists, social psychologists, psychologists. They were unable to make a single causal connection between social media usage and mental health problems in kids. There's a working paper circulating among European researchers who have now made a consensus statement. The only routine and reproducible finding they saw is that it increases teenage girls' tendency to compare themselves to other girls, which is surely bad, and we could talk a lot about. But I think, again, it's another theme. If it is the devil, right, then it's obviously the social media's fault, right, if we have this sort of narrative of a single kind of evil. But I think there is so much going on. There's the role of parents, there's the role of governments, there's the role of education, there's the role of COVID, there's a role, you can go on. And so much of the evidence has been convoluted. So one, and I think the big problem is that we don't have the study. So you could also say just the absence of causal evidence does not mean that a causal relationship does not exist. I totally agree with that. I think the deeper problem is, as researchers, we are not designing studies in a way that allow people to, for example, make laws. There's a real disconnect. We have a few ideas like echo chambers. We're still studying echo chambers somehow when there's bigger, deeper problems that we should all be on. So how do we create that better, tighter loop between what the science does and focuses on what is needed in the world? I think is a really good one. And on the algorithmic choice, I'm very persuadable that this is a great idea. The problem is people don't do it. People don't like a chronological time feed. People don't know about network effects. Unfortunately, they don't read Noshir's work. They should, right? But right, all of us should. Exactly, yeah. Playing to the
shameless
referee
plug.
there. Yeah. But the challenge, and this goes maybe back to user education, right? People don't know there's an alternative, right? So I think, in cases where companies have made this available, like Blue Sky, as you no doubt know, has this sort of ability for people to determine largely what they see, and yet people aren't using it from what we can tell. Mm-hmm. So it's a multifaceted problem, to come back to a theme.
Others want to add something?
Just to add to the competition issue, I also think the network effects play a large role. There was, at one point, everybody wanted to migrate to Mastodon, but it didn't happen because Mastodon, you don't get the same visibility, you don't get the same connectivity that is offered on X. So that is also a problem, and I don't think that mere transparency will solve the problem. On the other hand, of course, the Digital Services Act does try to implement some sort of oversight, for instance, through the systemic risk assessments, where if not the public, at least then the digital services coordinator will be able to see, if these algorithms actually do manipulate and coerce to a certain extent. And I think this is also it raises another issue that I've been thinking about a lot, that perhaps we have to start looking at these spaces as public utilities and not just privately owned digital spaces, which would allow people to have a bigger say on how they're governed. And that is one way, perhaps, of dealing with this manipulation and the coercion. With regard to children also, yes, it is indeed an education issue, because parents always protect their children when they go outside in the real world, if they go to the playground, if they go to the mall. But when the child is playing with a smartphone and on social media, they don't realize that the child is actually in a public space, which is as, if not more dangerous than the public spaces in the real world. So it also comes to an awareness problem there.
I'll try to be really short. First, on the children's side, one side that I want to add, we get the argument a lot, and it's even in the law partly, that children are specifically protected. But it depending on the topic, we have elderly people, for example, that the kids are then saying, my mom knows less about how this is going down than me. So on the age part, just to kind of put a little bit of an asterisk, but because it depends on the question and which age group is necessarily harmed more or less. One thing that I wanted to build on is the question of how to, for example, put academic know-how into the political debate. And that's one problem I massively see, especially being around in Brussels and so on, is that people dominate our law base. They kind of are talking about AI being great at bullshitting. This is a totally different league. And they dominate the airwaves. And it's really interesting that very hard evidence that is very clear and obvious is just totally neglected in the decision process because the scientific community is not proactively going there. And Brussels, for example, a lot of the political side knows that they're just constantly bombarded with demands, but that's not necessarily from the right side. And we actually had very good successes when just an academic that has worked on a topic for a year just flew to Brussels for a couple of days, had a couple of meetings, which usually works quite well, and then really could change the debate quite quickly. And I think there's a huge space for that, to have like a better connection there, to really have this information there. And I think Brussels is a bit of a positive example there, where that's still possible today. It's like a bit exceptional in the political space globally that's still possible. Last but not least, on the opening up, I think it's really something we have to be bold about. I mean, if you tell any American friend that we can have, I don't know, 50 internet providers out of the same line because we just basically opened up the last mile and that's it, they all get like, oh my God, I only have one provider and it costs a fortune and doesn't work. So I think we did that before in Europe, and just to apply that to the digital space oftentimes makes sense. I oftentimes try to motivate people by just looking at the analog example. A lot of the stuff in Austria, you still have to study Roman law from 2,000 years ago. A lot of the stuff is already, in principle, stuff the Romans have debated. and that sometimes calms people down to say, oh, if the Romans have already done that around a cow, then maybe we can do the same thing of, if your algorithm does something crazy, you are liable for it. We may have done that with the cow that went in the pasture over in 2,000 years ago, and maybe now it's the AI algorithm where the same thing is true. And that sometimes suddenly opens up thinking space that they could not possibly have thought about. And I think we must be much bolder on all of this to say, guys, this is not magic, this is a new thing, and let's just think what the problem is and how we solved it in 100 other issues. And if there's a nuance, because the thing is different, then we need to do the nuance, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel oftentimes.
Well, one of the things I have two more questions lined up, and then we'll come two more questions here. I will just mention something that I want to build on something Chris mentioned, and Suni, you mentioned. Suni, you mentioned, we think about parents are concerned about children outdoors but not online, and that's one of the very compelling refrains by Jonathan Haidt in his book that he's written about this topic. That said, I think what Chris was reminding us is that there is a very large number of scholars who challenge the research and the evidence that is provided by in that book by Jonathan. And so, in fact, we have an academic who can come to Brussels and persuade people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that within the academic community, within the national academies, there is a lot of support for. I'm just laying out there that there's a huge divide, and my social media feed is full of my academic friends who are vehemently opposed and challenging all of the evidence that Jonathan is presenting on many public fora and so on. So just something to recognize that academics are not united on this. Yes?
Yeah, so first of all, really excellent discussion, but one thing that really struck me as I was listening to the three of you, we have a semantic problem that actually underlies a broader metaphysical issue. And that is, we're always referring to people as users, as if they were addicts, so that there's a asymmetrical relationship. We deny them the agency that we would deny anyone else. Why don't we call them digital citizens? Why don't we give them agency, responsibility, and rights that come in equal measure? I mean, I'm in part just pointing out that we've grown so used to this notion of asymmetry and addiction. And I think Mark Rockenberg made a really great point. These are companies that optimize for that because that's the product that they're selling. So I think that's one point. The other thing which I think is really important to bear in mind, and I was really interested in what you had to say on some of the positive reinforcement kind of algorithm. We're dealing with predictive machines, okay? These are not rational machines. When we talk in computer science terms about synthetic data, we're overlooking the fact that these machines at the end of the day are meant to be sycophantic in terms of giving us answers that we want, not necessarily establishing a truth. And there's a huge danger built into that, because it's a behavioral. It comes from behavioral science, not from computer science, in terms of how we need to understand these machines. And where this crosses over with social media, I was looking up a statistic as you were talking. So as of 4 months ago, more than 50% on content on LinkedIn is AI generated. Everyone wants to be smart. Everyone wants to be convincing. I would predict that in the next 3 years, social media and the way that we know it will disappear, and it'll actually be a somewhat different version of a chatbot that we use in order to somehow deal with a community that we've constructed around our ideas. And then, in that situation, we really start to lose agency. Thanks.
Good question. Comments?
I would just like to clarify. So when I refer to them as users, that is because I'm coming from this copyright kind of terminology where we have the creator and we have the user who uses the content. But that's a very good point, you know, whether when we refer to someone as a social media user, whether that means that we see them as an entity having less agency, less rights. For me, that's not the case, because I think a user or a consumer is somebody who has or should have a lot of rights, because that is the person who is in one of the central nodes of this whole economic interaction. And as regards to the other point about this, you know, this manipulation, the being sycophantic, again, I see that as a big threat, and it's already there, and that's part of it with, you know, our understanding that whatever social or AI generates is better than what we can do ourselves or what somebody else can do. That is why students are now using ChatGPT to generate answers when they can actually write better answers themselves, but if you tell them that, they're not convinced. And I really don't know how to solve that. But again, for me, that is a design issue. It is perhaps something that can be solved with regulation, with awareness of the digital citizens, if you like. Yeah.
Other comments?
We call people data subjects in GDPR, so I don't think we can help much on it. Like, user is already a positive move up from what we do. But you know, after all, it's like, if in reality we can be, you know, we used to be the subject of a king because that was it. And if we can change the system we're in, then you de facto become the citizen, and that's, you know, then probably the word follows the reality, or the other way around. We can talk about that.
I'd just like to pick up on the small data point about LinkedIn and 50% of users. You know, I'm not saying it's wrong, but AI detectors also recently classified the US Declaration of Independence as AI generated with 99% probability, right? But this raises an interesting question, which is, how are we going to figure out what is AI generated and what isn't? And it kind of comes back to what a user is. And there's some pretty interesting research on this point. So, you know, we all know now these things can pass a Turing test, more or less, demanding, you know, simple version of a Turing test, right? You show someone AI-generated content, you show them human content, and lo and behold, it's a coin flip. Nobody can tell. But this very interesting study by Maurice Jaquesh, a Swiss researcher, asked people, now, why do you think this is AI generated? Why do you think this is human generated? And overwhelmingly, people say things like, well, this is human because it talks about other people. It talks about having friends. It talks about social things, right? So obviously, those of us who know these things are trained, it's like, of course, it can talk about people. It can impersonate, you know, any sort of social being. The problem is we're using the wrong heuristics to make these decisions. And we also have overconfidence. You know, as college professors, we have, you know, students being accused of plagiarism wrongly. You know, we will soon have not just threats to our political identities, our social identities, but our very humanity. It's a really, you know, digital humanism. It's, you know, this is really the crux of the issue. What is it going to mean to be labeled human in these online spaces where we can't verify each other's existence? It's a big question.
Also on the same issue, Karim Lakhani, who is a professor at Harvard Business School, has written widely and extensively about the concern that it's not that AI is going to replace humans, but humans with AI are going to replace humans without AI. And I think as you look at the different ways in which we are using AI to post things on the web, it's entirely possible that all of us will use it. And to your point, Chris, from the study, from the Nextdoor study, that may be a good thing if the AI could suggest something that is a little more civil as compared to it. So we have 3 hands that are very actively working on the fitness program here. So I'm going to take questions from all 3 of you and then field answers here. 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, thank you. So Moshe introduced 2 C's, and I'd like to introduce 2 A's. The first is authority. And what strikes me about social media, the frameworks that we have, they're essentially borderless, right? So the question of regulating them, the question of oversight of them, begs the question, who is the authority, where is the authority? Can these things exist? Should these things exist in a multi-authority sort of context? Is it possible even to even conceive of what that would look like? So the first one is authority. The second is accountability, which kind of goes along with that. And, you know, Max made this comment about, well, people are just blowing through things. I happen to live right now in a country where you know, it's questionable whether any of these judgments by judges are actually enforceable. If someone isn't going to listen to the judge, so, you know, and these are companies, what do you do? And they're powerful and they kind of own the government already. So, you know, I was hoping to move back to Europe because I thought at least that was a place that was a place of laws. But it sounds like that's not even true in Europe. So, you know, how do we deal with those two A's?
Okay, we'll take the next two questions and then we'll see how much time we have left before answering it. And then, yeah.
So just really a brief question. First of all, thank you. Through these 2-3 days, I learned the genie is out of the bottle, so, and it's multifaceted. So thank you for, you know, looking at it from different perspective. What I'm missing from the equation when I look at the lessons learned, my concern is that we have now the alpha generation who is, you know, the digital natives. What does it do to cognitive and brain development? I know you're not neuroscientists, but do you have is there any research? Because that is my concern with all the likes, we know it does with something with your brain and talking. So if there's any research out there, because that is also a lesson, something we should look into, what we are growing into long term as humans.
One more last question and then we'll go, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, hello, Max, I'm a big fan of you. I think that it should be someone like you in all countries in Europe, because we need some leaders that for the good, because now we have leaders for the bad. So I think that should be leaders for the good, for activism. And my question is regarding, I'm really worried about the usage of AI about Meta, what they are doing for training their models. And I'm a little bit, I'm disagreeing with you, Sumi, because you know that, for example, there was the Google case that they cannot, in the past, they cannot reproduce the news on the extract. So anything that we have published on Instagram or Facebook, they can use it. Even the comments, all we have in public. So I disagree a little bit with you, because you have only put the attention on their output, but even I think that there is an infringement of copyrights, really huge infringement from the input. Because, for example, I have a lot of friends, I'm a millennial, I have a lot of friends that use Instagram for artist purposes, so I paint as well, but I have object, they give us the object, but it was not announced properly. I have seen in LinkedIn from someone, and then I have done some advertising in my personal profile in Instagram. Nobody has cared, but I have done it. So I don't know. My question is on the input regarding their training and the fact that the content is not protected, and I feel that we are used like they are taking stuff from us all the time, and we are without anything to protect us. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you for all 3 excellent questions, and we have all of 4 minutes to answer them with 3 panelists. Maybe we'll go a couple of minutes beyond 3:30, as we have done with some of the other sessions today. So it's all yours.
Then people look at me, okay. So authority and accountability. I think I'm still rather confident in most European countries about the constitutional system being up and running and working fine. And in Austria, we have the luck of being one of the first countries that has seen right-wing populism ever since, so we know everything what not to do and how not to solve it. But at least we sustained it, so there is a difference in the constitutional fabric. And so on this side, I'm happy, I think it's doable. what's really interesting compared to that being like countries where almost everything is regulated and enforced is that in the digital sphere we exactly do not do that. And that's a bit the outlier in my vision, is that kind of generally, I mean, we have someone walking into our nonprofit office each year to check if our desks are the right height for our employees or whatever. But you know, if it comes to companies taking 1 million data pieces somewhere else, then no one checks that. And it's largely political. I mean, the reality is we have European law and then we have national enforcement, and if the member states just don't put someone there that does it politically motivated, then that's the end result, and that's my short take on that. I think on the other points, just quickly, because like that there should be other people. We're luckily 25, but we just do GDPR, and there's a lot of people that do many other very important topics in this room. So it would be great if on these other topics people also get a bit more maybe into the fighting mode then in the end, because in the end, unless like some court says niet, they just do it anyways. Just as a motivational speech coming out of that, I hope.
Great, thanks. Other comments, reactions to the questions?
I could respond to the copyright question,
Yeah.
but unless you want to go in order.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, that is, no, I completely understand your outrage, because you feel, I think, based on what you said, you see this as being unjust enrichment, right? They're using something that they didn't pay to produce, and they're not really compensating you for it. But the thing is that if you post something, say on Instagram, and you're allowing everybody to see it, then what is stopping someone else from seeing those same images, being inspired by it, and mimicking that or trying to create something similar? And you would say, okay, that's different because the way a human does it and the way the AI does it, there's a difference in scale, right? The AI can train itself on a huge amount of images, and it can just create output at a much larger scale than the human. But on the other hand, if you really want to stop the AI from learning, that is also possible, because then in the EU we have the opt-out of Article 4 for the data mining exception. So if you only post your content on platforms that say it is not possible to engaging in data mining on this platform, then technically they're not allowed to do that. But the problem comes for me when the creators say, I don't mind them using it, or I want them to use it, but you have to pay me for the use. For me, that is something that goes beyond the scope of copyright, because copyright is not there to remunerate users that are just engaged in for the purpose of learning from a work or being inspired from a work. It is there to remunerate for users where that content or a modification or a development of it is being made available to the public. So for me, this is a very dangerous thing, and this comes down again to the argument we had against sort of user-generated content on YouTube, that when people are using these movie clips and they're creating mashups and they're putting it on YouTube, that is a copyright infringement. Why should that be a copyright infringement? Where does it take away from your ability to obtain some economic return from the content you have made available to the public? So it is not at a general level that I'm saying that this should be allowed, it's not, but from a copyright angle, what I'm saying is that there is no justifiable basis I can see for saying you have to pay me a license for doing this.
I can see lots of this follow-on conversation
maybe later
over coffee in the break. Yeah, let me give Chris a chance to have the last word, and then I want to wrap up here so that we're almost on time. Chris.
Yeah, you asked a great question about cognition, and personally, I don't think we know the answer yet. And I think there's so many of these questions where we are focused on short-term concerns about AI, and we don't yet understand what it is doing to us in the long term. I think a tiny piece of evidence that might be of interest, though, is a recent collaboration between MIT and OpenAI, which looked at mental health effects of use of large language models. Pretty interesting finding, which is, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but in the short term, positive impacts. So people are using LLMs, as many of us know, for mental health, and of course we have egregious cases of things going very wrong. But overall, the people who are using OpenAI's models seem to do better in the short term. In the longer term, though, they report more loneliness and social isolation. So something we researchers are keeping our eye on. Yeah.
In fact, I'm blanking on the name of the book, but there's a recent book and a story in The Economist about researchers at Oxford who are looking at how the rewiring of the brain is happening as a result of social media use. So there is some work being done in that area. I don't think we know much about the answer. So in closing, as part of thanking our panel and thanking those wonderful questions that we receive, I'm going to now keep this tradition of going with alliterative letters and give you 3 Ps that we have talked about today: polarization, privacy, and property, actually intellectual property, but I had to do the 3 Ps there. and then I also want to say that what this panel has shown us, the conversations we've had, is the stakes are really high because we are in the process of trying to rebuild the public sphere. We're thinking of reshaping rights, and we are reimagining identity. And without the level of collaboration and discourse across different perspectives that we've seen here, we're never going to have even a hopeful chance of success in doing all of those things. So with that, again, I want to thank our panel. Thanks for the questions. And let's continue this as we go into our next coffee break, and probably final coffee break. Thank you again.
Thank you.